Hi, my name is May. I use they, them pronouns, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to correctly queer your data. Let's get started. So let's talk about the problem to address today. Obviously, if you've clicked on this video, you must be in some way aware that queer and transgender people are often overlooked in data. And this becomes a problem because even though data is not very flashy, I'm not necessarily a data person myself. I don't consider myself a data-minded person. It could potentially have a lot of influence in actual policy-making decisions, even medical care. So that's why we're going to be focusing on how to correctly represent queer and transgender people in your data today from a queer and transgender person myself. The way we take and use data has a direct impact on LGBTQ plus people through policy, advocacy, and things like funding. It's really vital that the data that we collect is inclusive and accurate to prevent issues in things like data cross-contamination, misappropriation of funds, even ensuring policy decision gaps. Right now, there's a gap between education about LGBTQ plus issues and identities and the implementation of data collection on that issue. So today I'm going to be giving you some pointers, some common mistakes that I see, and also ways that we can improve as a community and as people who are going forward to represent the LGBTQ plus community in the best way that you can. So let's talk about surveys. It's not necessarily everyone's first choice, right? But I'm going to be using this as a case study today to talk about data as a whole. Like I said, I'm not a data-minded person. I'm not the kind of person who sits in an Excel document for fun, but surveys is an easy way and something that's really accessible to everyone. Surveys are a really small part of data collection, but they can have a huge impact on policies and programs. So let's talk about why this is important, right? Like I just said, this is something that applies across all sorts of different fields. So you could talk about medicine, job searches, grants and funding, media, your personal representation, policy decisions, social services. This is something that is easily accessible, and it also has a huge impact on lots of different communities. So the cost of cleaning messy data or having to redo a whole survey or having a corrupted survey are huge. You would rather get it right the first time. It's something that is really important. And I've heard a lot of people say that well, why can't we just have a survey that is colorblind, right? But unfortunately, when you have colorblindness, it actually corrupts survey data and sometimes can make the entire survey useless. Like, what if you were looking for clothing types of your constituents or clothing types of people who go to your business and you didn't look for gender or for gender expression? Obviously, it's going to be useless data, right? You need to have that information. So that's why we're looking for a best way to make a survey that isn't colorblind, but sees color in a way that is effective, in a way that actually is inclusive of diversity around us. I also want to make sure that I point out that without good demographic information, problems can't be addressed in a way that's efficient. Like, for example, if you have a single bad survey question, it can completely alienate the group you're trying to connect with. Like, say, if you were trying to get more information on the transgender community, but you asked something that was inappropriate, or you asked a question in a way that marginalized them further, you're just going to be ruining your whole data, and you're also going to make that community group not trust you. So that's why it's incredibly important to have data that is representing these people in a way that is inclusive and also understanding of the people you're trying to represent. So let's talk about some common mistakes that I see all the time. So one of the first ones I see is in the issue of looking for sex, right? So this is something you see on a lot of forums, even for job applications. They want to know your sex, whether that's for EEOC forms or just in general diversity questions. I see a lot of people will put man and woman as sex categories, which obviously is not helpful because man and woman are not sex identifications at all. Those are gender identifications. And I even have seen sometimes people will put non-binary on the sex category, which again doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll go into that later, but you can't have non-binary as your sex identification. That's not how things work. Even other as your sex identification, there's only going to be 3 options that I'll talk about in a second, but that's a common mistake that I see. Moving on to gender, a lot of people mess up the gender question. I think it's from people trying to be inclusive, but unfortunately it doesn't come off as that. So a lot of the times I see a mix up between sex and gender, again, that comes in here. So they'll put male or female down on gender, or even just transgender as a label, which is obviously very confusing, or trans woman or man, which I just want to point out that a trans woman and a trans man are not different from a woman or a man. Just the trans label is not helpful in this instance. Or even putting, separate gender nonconforming or GNC identities in the same category or option, like saying non-binary and third gender are the same thing. They're not. It creates more confusion, especially for the people you're trying to represent, or even adding lots of different sub options, like saying, oh, well, I'm going to add X, Y, and Z option, like agender and stuff like that. That just becomes more confusing, especially for people who aren't part of the gender nonconforming community, who don't know what these identities are and will automatically be, oh, it's all snowflakes or PC culture. That's not what we want. It's more confusing. So let's move on to sexuality problems that I see really commonly. One of them is this correlation between gay and lesbian as identifiers. Unfortunately, I see this a lot, and it's something that really frustrates me because the identity of gay and the identity of lesbian are not the same thing. Gay can, depending on the community you're in, refer to lots of different ways of experiencing the LGBTQ plus community. Lesbian is usually more specific, so we need to be sure that we have those as separate identities in the sexuality category. And also putting bisexual but not putting pansexual down. Those are also, unfortunately, things that I see very often because more people know about bisexuality and less about pansexuality. Another common problem that I see is not putting asexual as an option or queer as an option. And I think this becomes a huge issue, especially because a lot more people, especially young people, are identifying as queer. And unfortunately, that's not an option. I mean, in my own example, I would identify as queer. So what do I put down on a sexuality option that doesn't have that? And these are kind of issues that I see very frequently in sexuality questions. So let's talk a little bit about gender expression. I've gotten this kind of question before, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But gender expression questions are always very complicated. They're usually asked for no reason, and the question usually has no relevance to the survey. I find that people ask that and think that they're trying to be inclusive of gender identity. Make sure that you're asking gender expression questions for the right reason. You don't want to just ask them for no reason. You don't need to know whether or not I'm wearing feminine clothes or masculine clothes that day, unless you're specifically looking for, clothing examples. So let's talk about a better option for your survey. So the first thing I would do is make sure if you're asking a question about the participant's sex, you need to ask that question. I find a lot of people ask this sex question and gender question separately, and I always caution them not to ask about the sex of the person who's filling out their survey unless it's absolutely necessary. I want to remind people that the sex question is explicitly asking about things like genitalia. If you don't need to know your participant's genitalia, there is no reason to ask a sex question. Of course, for the medical field, that's going to be an exception, or a dating site potentially, but it's very, very select when you would need to know a specific question about genitalia or about chromosomes and stuff like that. So for a sex question, if, let's give an example, in a medical field, you needed to know the sex of your participant, you would want to have the options male, female, intersex, and decline to state. Intersex is a bit of a complicated identity that I'll probably go into in future videos. Intersex is going to be a sexual identity that is in between male and female or outside of male and female, but that's also should be included in your sex options, as not everyone is assigned male or female at birth. There are some people who are assigned intersex or find out later that they are intersex. So it's important to include them, but it's also important to make sure that you have the right terminology in the sex category. But male and female are the ones you probably recognize. Again, these are sex terms, not gender terms. Do not use them in the gender context. They're exclusively to talk about genitalia and sex assigned at birth. So that's why we're using those terms. So let's talk a little bit about gender. So the gender option should have a couple of different points in there. First, of course, you can have man and woman. Those are ones that you're going to see the most commonly. And I would also recommend you have non-binary or, slash genderqueer. Those are identities that are more umbrella terms and that are used by the community to represent anyone who is outside of the binary of man and woman. They can cover multiple different identities and also are eclipsing of the gender nonconforming community. But if you want to have a separate identity for people who want to add something else, I would put different identity and have a section where you can put in your own option. So, you can click on that and you would have an underscore where you could write in your own option. And of course, you would have decline to state as your final option. I want to make sure to reference that man and woman should be the only options you have. The reason why I'm saying that is because I see a lot of people say trans women should be a separate option for gender identity. Again, I want to say that gender is different than sex. So unless you specifically need to know that the person who's applying for this position or form or whatever is transgender and specifically identifies as a transgender man or woman, that would be something that you'd find out through the sex option and the gender option combined, not something that is a gender identity. I can't identify as a transgender woman. I only identify as a woman who is trans. So that's the difference there. So that's why you're only going to have man, woman, non-binary, different identity, and decline to state as your gender identity options. So let's talk about sexuality. So again, we're gonna have a lot more options here to be more inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community. So we're gonna have straight or heterosexual. Those are ones that you're familiar with. Gay and lesbian, separate categories. Let me make sure I say that correctly. Bisexual, pansexual, asexual, queer, which again, I pointed out is a identity that has been used a lot more by the queer and trans community, and different identity. Again, this is going to be an option where you can write in your own identity if you wish to do so, and of course, decline to state. So the reason why I have all these other options are these are very, very common options within the queer and trans community that are used, but you also have, of course, for some reason, if someone wants to use a different identity or a different terminology, they can put that in there. This will hopefully help single out your data in a way that is more helpful to you, but also is more accurate for the people who are going to be taking your survey. So let's talk again about gender expression, like I just mentioned. Gender expression is kind of an awkward thing to talk about because it's not going to be used in very many instances. Gender expression is usually only going to be used in the instance where you need to know specifically about behavior or maybe clothing choices. I would not recommend putting this in here unless, again, you're a clothing brand or your survey has something to do with this and it's directly relevant to your survey. You don't need to know about someone's gender expression for something like food choices. There's no correlation there, right? So for gender expression, if you were going to ask that for a clothing store, again, I would say something like masculine, feminine, neutral, mixed, something else if there's some other option that I haven't thought up myself, and decline to state. So again, this is going to be a very specific case when you would ask these questions, but for some reason, if you did need to ask those questions for your survey, those are the options that I would recommend. And finally, the transgender question. I always recommend this, especially of people who are trying to be inclusive of transgender people in their survey. So this goes back to our earlier discussion where we talked about how man, woman, non-binary, different identity, decline to state should be our gender options. This is if you need to know about diversity statistics. So if you really did need to know, like for diversity for a job application, whether or not someone was transgender, I would ask the transgender question, which is going to be less alienating than saying, are you a trans woman versus like quote unquote a real woman, right? So the transgender question is going to say yes, no, or decline to state. And I want to be clear here, if you are not cisgender, cis is from Latin of same gendered, cisgendered, and transgender from Latin means different. So different gendered, transgendered. If you're not the same gender as you were assigned at birth, then you were transgender. So that's why we're gonna be putting it on this questionnaire. I'd also make sure to be aware that you may have some non-binary or genderqueer people put transgender down as a yes. I would personally do that because I identify both as non-binary and as transgender, but you may not have all people do that. So be aware that you might have some mixed results in that section if you're looking at the data. A good way to counteract problems that you have with your survey is allowing people to write in the option, but of course this isn't necessarily great for data purposes, so that's why it's also important to allow people who are taking your survey to choose multiple identities if they wish to do so on options such as gender, sexuality, and gender expression. So again, we want to provide people with the opportunity to choose things that would help our data and help make the data a lot cleaner, but we also want to provide people an understanding of, hey, your identity may not fall under these categories, and we want to be understanding of that and understanding of the LGBTQ plus community as a whole. So let's talk a little bit about steps that you can take to be inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community around you, and especially in your data taking. So one of the first things I always tell people is to continue to have conversations with diverse individuals around you. That's the easiest way to really get to know what diversity is and understand these conversations are always ongoing, especially talking to advocacy groups within your circle and how they want to be represented in their own communities. You know, this applies to all parts of diversity as well. It's the same as in race and ethnicity questions as it is on LGBTQ plus questions. So be aware that you need to be talking and having these daily and monthly conversations with the diversity around you. It's also really important to focus on self-education. Don't assume your one friend at work who's LGBTQ plus or trans or queer will want to educate you on all these really, really complicated subjects. It takes a lot of work on our part to be educated, and so don't assume one person will be able to give you the education that you need. You need to reach out to things like YouTube, things like Twitch, reaching out to all these social media networks, to advocacy groups, to people who do diversity and inclusion work, and that way you can get a diversity of answers about your diversity questions. So you need to have multiple different sources, and also just do your own work on the side to educate yourself on these issues. Now, you might be asking me, well, how can I improve as a data researcher, right? And if you are a data researcher or if you're taking a survey, always ask yourself, what am I missing, right? How can I improve? Run your survey and data by people who will be affected by the survey and data and see if there's anything that they would add or anything that they would change about it, ways that they can increase the diversity of your whole idea. And also, of course, always ask yourself the purpose of the survey, right? Like, why do you need this information? This comes down to this question again of, I get a lot of questions about, should I ask about sex in an educational survey? Not necessarily applicable, right? You don't need to know the genitalia of your students, right? So always be willing to adjust and change as needed to better serve the community that you're trying to connect with. Again, this is about making those connections between the data researcher and the humanity behind the data that you're trying to collect. For companies and organizations who are wondering about increasing diversity around them, I just want to point out that reaching out to potential partners in advance is a great way to get one step ahead of collecting data, especially on the LGBTQ plus community. You know, starting the conversation before the need is even realized is a great way to get ahead of the problem and address issues early on the discriminatory problems that become too ingrained into a company's cultures to change after long periods of time. It's also important to note that LGBTQ plus inclusion and economic development are mutually reinforcing concepts. So actually, policies that recognize and highlight LGBTQ plus diversity in an organization are good business sense. They help your organization and they'll help you attract the kind of diverse and amazing employees that will help your organization grow as a whole. And now I leave the question to you. How would you improve the inclusivity of data on the queer and trans community? Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can give it a like below. I'd also consider subscribing if I were you. I'm actually planning on making stuff in the future, and you don't want to miss out.